Picture this. You wake up at dawn, but instead of rushing to a 9-to-5 job, you might not work at all today. In fact, you'll probably have more days off this year than a modern American worker with paid vacation. Sound impossible? Welcome to the shocking reality of being a medieval peasant farmer. Everything you think you know about life in the Middle Ages is probably wrong. We've been fed this image of miserable serfs toiling endlessly in muddy fields, barely surviving on scraps of bread. But here's the truth that will blow your mind. Medieval peasants actually had it. Better than most modern workers in ways you never imagined. They worked fewer hours, had more vacation time, enjoyed a social safety net that would make today's gig economy workers weep with envy. I know what you're thinking. This sounds absolutely crazy. How could people living 800 years ago without electricity, cars, or smartphones possibly have had better work-life balance than us? The answer lies in an economic system so different from ours that it's almost alien to modern minds. But before we dive into this rabbit hole of medieval surprises, let me paint you a picture of what a typical day actually looked like for someone like William the Plowman in 13th century England. It's going to shatter every assumption you've ever had about the Dark Ages. Because spoiler alert, they weren't actually that dark. And by the end of this journey, you might find yourself questioning whether we've actually progressed as much as we think we have. So buckle up, because we're about to time travel to an era that was far more complex, surprising, and frankly more humane than Hollywood has ever shown you. The medieval world is about to get real. 1. Shocking daily life. Let's start with the biggest mythbuster of all. Medieval peasants worked way less than you do. While you're grinding through your 40-hour work week, a medieval farmer worked roughly 150 days per year. That's less than half the days a modern full-time employee works. But wait, it gets even more shocking. During winter months, from November to February, most peasants barely worked at all. They spent their time repairing tools, telling stories, and basically hibernating like human bears. The Catholic Church declared over 100 holy days throughout the year where work was forbidden. Add Sundays to that, and you're looking at nearly half the year being official time off. Compare that to the average American worker who gets 10 vacation days per year if they're lucky. Now, you might be thinking, but surely they were starving and miserable during all this free time. Here's where it gets really wild. Medieval peasants actually ate better than most people think. Archaeological evidence from medieval garbage dumps reveals a diet that would surprise you. They consumed massive amounts of ale, up to a gallon per day for adults. It's not because they were alcoholics, but because ale was safer than water and provided essential calories. Their bread wasn't the moldy scraps we imagine, but hearty loaves made from barley, oats, and rye. They ate cheese, eggs, and bacon regularly. During harvest festivals, they feasted on roasted meats that would make modern barbecue enthusiasts jealous. The famous pottage wasn't gruel. It was a thick, nutritious stew packed with vegetables, grains, and often meat. Medieval cookbooks show recipes with exotic spices that cost more than a peasant's annual income. But here's the kicker. These spices were often provided by their lords during special occasions. The feudal system, despite its flaws, created a social contract where lords had genuine obligations to feed and protect their peasants. When harvests failed, lords were expected to open their granaries. During wars, peasants could seek refuge in the lord's castle. This wasn't charity. It was a legal obligation that could result in serious consequences if ignored. Medieval peasants also had something modern workers desperately lack: job security. You couldn't be fired from being a peasant. Your land tenure was hereditary and protected by law. Even the most tyrannical lord couldn't just kick you off your land without serious legal justification. Try getting that kind of job security in today's gig economy. The work itself followed natural rhythms that modern science now tells us are healthier for human beings. They woke with the sun and slept when it got dark. No artificial lighting meant their circadian rhythms stayed perfectly aligned with nature. During planting and harvest seasons, yes, they worked intensively. But these periods were followed by long stretches of minimal labor. It's like having several months of vacation built into your job description. And here is something that will really blow your mind. Medieval peasants were often more literate than we give them credit for. Recent archaeological discoveries show that even rural peasants could often read basic Latin and keep simple accounts. They had to. Managing a farm required understanding contracts, calculating tithes, and keeping track of complex crop rotations. The stereotype of the ignorant, brutish peasant is largely a creation of later centuries trying to justify their own superiority. 2. Feudal system and social reality. Now let's destroy another massive misconception. Medieval peasants weren't slaves. The feudal system was actually a sophisticated social contract that provided benefits most modern workers would kill for. Yes, peasants were bound to the land, but this wasn't the prison sentence history books make it seem. It was more like having a guaranteed job with housing, health care, and legal protection all rolled into one. Here's how it really worked. When you were born a peasant, you inherited not just obligations but rights. Your lord couldn't arbitrarily raise your rent or kick you out because he felt like it. Medieval law was surprisingly specific about what lords could and couldn't demand from their peasants. The famous 3 days work rule meant peasants typically owed only 3 days of labor per week to their lord's land. The other 4 days? That was their time to work their own plots and make their own money. Compare that to modern workers who give their entire week to one employer and pray for overtime pay. But here's where it gets really interesting. Peasants could actually sue their lords in court. Medieval court records are full of cases where peasants successfully challenged their lords over unfair treatment. In 1278, the peasants of Peasant Magna took their lord to court for demanding excessive labor. They won. The lord was forced to reduce their obligations and pay compensation. Try suing your boss for making you work too much overtime and see how that goes. Medieval peasants also had something called common rights that were absolutely revolutionary for their time. They could graze their animals on common land, collect firewood from forests, and fish in streams. These weren't privileges, they were legal rights that couldn't be taken away. When lords tried to enclose common lands, peasants often revolted, and frequently won. The famous Peasants' Revolt of 1381 wasn't just angry mobs with pitchforks. It was a sophisticated political movement with clear demands for legal reform. Here's the shocking part. Many of their demands were actually met. The feudal system also provided what we'd now call universal health care. Lords were legally obligated to care for sick or injured peasants. Medieval manor records show regular payments for medical care, including hiring physicians for peasant families. When peasants got too old to work, they didn't face homelessness or starvation. The manor system included provisions for elderly care that were legally enforceable. Your lord couldn't just abandon you when you became unprofitable. This social safety net was so comprehensive that some historians argue it was more effective than many modern welfare systems. The relationship between lords and peasants was also far more personal than the corporate hierarchy we know today. Lords lived on the same land as their peasants, attended the same church, and often knew peasant families for generations. When a peasant's son showed promise, lords frequently sponsored their education or apprenticeship. Medieval records are full of peasant children who became clerks, craftsmen, or even knights through their lord's patronage. Social mobility wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible either. The famous William Marshal, one of England's greatest knights, started as the younger son of a minor lord with no inheritance. Through skill and patronage, he became regent of England. Even more surprising, peasant women had rights that would shock modern audiences. They could own property, run businesses, and represent themselves in court. Medieval brewing was dominated by women called alewives, who ran profitable businesses from their homes. These weren't side hustles. They were serious enterprises that provided economic independence. Peasant marriages were also more egalitarian than Victorian-era relationships. Both spouses typically worked and contributed to household income. Decision-making was often shared, especially regarding farm management and children's futures. The stereotype of the oppressed medieval woman comes largely from later periods, not the Middle Ages themselves. Perhaps most surprisingly, medieval peasants had more control over their work environment than most modern employees. They set their own schedules during their 4 free days per week. They could choose which crops to plant on their personal plots. They could start side businesses without asking permission from their lord. Many peasants became successful merchants, craftsmen, or moneylenders, while still maintaining their agricultural obligations. The feudal system wasn't perfect. No system is. But it provided stability, security, and social support in ways that might make modern gig workers weep with envy. When we strip away the Hollywood stereotypes and look at actual historical records, medieval peasants emerge as surprisingly empowered people living within a system designed to protect them as much as exploit them. 3. Other surprising facts? Ready for your mind to be completely blown? Medieval peasants had better dental health than people in the 18th and 19th centuries. Archaeological analysis of medieval skulls shows surprisingly healthy teeth with minimal decay. Why? Their diet was low in refined sugar and high in coarse grains that naturally cleaned their teeth. They also chewed on twigs and herbs that had antibacterial properties. It wasn't until sugar became widely available in later centuries that dental health actually got worse. So much for the progress of civilization. Here's another shocker. Medieval peasants were probably cleaner than your great-great-grandparents. The stereotype of filthy, unwashed medieval people is complete nonsense. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval villages had sophisticated waste management systems. They built latrines downstream from water sources and had strict rules about where animals could be kept. Medieval people bathed regularly in rivers, streams, and public bathhouses. The famous dirty medieval peasant image actually comes from much later periods, when urbanization made sanitation more difficult. Medieval peasants also lived in a world that was far more colorful and beautiful than Hollywood suggests. Their clothes weren't all brown and gray sackcloth. Even peasant clothing was often dyed in bright colors using local plants and minerals. Red from madder root, blue from woad, yellow from saffron. Medieval villages were riots of color. Their homes weren't dark, smoky hovels either. Archaeological excavations reveal houses with multiple rooms, glass windows, and sophisticated heating systems. Many peasant homes had decorative wall paintings and carved wooden furniture. The dark, primitive medieval world is largely a Renaissance invention designed to make later periods look more advanced. But here's perhaps the most mind-blowing fact of all. Medieval peasants had more leisure time for creative pursuits than most modern people. During those long winter months when farm work was minimal, peasants became artists, musicians, and storytellers. They carved intricate wooden sculptures, composed songs, and created elaborate tapestries. Many of the folktales we still tell today were created by illiterate peasants during their abundant free time. The famous Robin Hood legends, created by peasants who understood social justice better than most modern politicians. Medieval peasants also had access to technology that was incredibly advanced for its time. The heavy plow, invented in the early Middle Ages, was more sophisticated than anything used in ancient Rome. Medieval windmills and watermills were engineering marvels that wouldn't be improved upon for centuries. The three-field crop rotation system was so efficient that it remained the standard until the Industrial Revolution. These weren't primitive people stumbling around in the dark. They were innovative problem solvers, creating solutions that lasted for hundreds of years. Medieval peasants even had better work-life balance. When it came to family time, because most work was done close to home, fathers were present for their children's daily lives in ways that modern commuting dads can only dream of. Children learned trades by working alongside their parents, creating strong family bonds. Extended families often lived in the same village for generations, providing support networks that modern nuclear families lack. The elderly weren't shipped off to nursing homes. They remained integral parts of family and community life. Here's something that will really mess with your head. Medieval peasants had more economic security than many modern workers. They couldn't be laid off during economic downturns. Their housing was guaranteed for life. Their food supply was protected by law. When times got tough, the entire community rallied to help struggling families. Compare that to modern workers who can lose their jobs, homes, and health insurance in a single day. Medieval peasants also lived in a world with far less inequality than ours. While lords were certainly wealthier than peasants, the gap wasn't the astronomical difference we see today. A medieval lord might have lived in a stone house while peasants lived in wooden ones, but both had roofs, walls, and heat. Today's wealth gap between CEOs and minimum wage workers would have been incomprehensible to medieval minds. Perhaps most surprisingly, medieval peasants had more control over their government than most people realize. Village assemblies made local decisions democratically. Peasants elected their own officials and created their own laws for local matters. When kings demanded excessive taxes, Peasant communities often successfully negotiated reductions. The idea that medieval people were passive subjects with no political voice is another myth that needs to die. Finally, here's the ultimate irony. Medieval peasants worked in harmony with natural cycles in ways that modern environmentalists are desperately trying to recreate. They practiced sustainable agriculture without even knowing the term. Their farming methods actually improved soil quality over time. They lived in what we'd now call carbon-neutral communities. Maybe, just maybe, these primitive people knew something about living well that we've forgotten in our rush toward progress. Closing. So here we are. At the end of our journey through the real Middle Ages, and if you're feeling a little disoriented right now, that's completely normal. Everything you thought you knew about medieval life has just been turned upside down. Those dark ages weren't so dark after all, were they? In fact, in many ways, medieval peasants had figured out something we seem to have lost: how to live a balanced, sustainable, and surprisingly fulfilling life. They worked less, stressed less, and had more time for family, creativity, and community than most of us can even imagine. They lived in harmony with natural rhythms instead of fighting against them. They had job security, healthcare, and social support systems that would make modern workers weep with envy. They built communities that lasted for generations instead of constantly chasing the next opportunity. But here's the real question this raises. If medieval peasants had it so good, what happened? How did we go from a system that prioritized human well-being and community support to one that treats people as disposable resources? When did we decide that working ourselves to death was somehow more advanced than living in balance? The answer is complicated, but it starts with understanding that progress isn't always what it seems. The Industrial Revolution brought us amazing technologies, but it also destroyed many of the social structures that protected ordinary people. We gained efficiency, but lost security. We gained individual freedom, but lost community support. We gained material wealth, but lost work-life balance. Maybe it's time to ask ourselves, what can we learn from these medieval peasants? Not that we should go back to the Middle Ages, that's neither possible nor desirable. But maybe we can reclaim some of the wisdom they had about what makes life worth living. Maybe we can remember that humans aren't machines designed to maximize productivity. Maybe we can rebuild communities that actually support their members instead of just extracting value from them. Maybe we can rediscover the radical idea that people deserve security, dignity, and time to be human. The medieval peasants we've met today weren't perfect, and their world wasn't a utopia. But they understood something fundamental that we've either forgotten, that a good life isn't measured by how much you produce, but by how well you live. They knew that work should serve life, not the other way around. They knew that community matters more than competition. They knew that sustainability isn't just an environmental buzzword. It's a way of life that honors both human needs and natural limits. So the next time someone tells you that medieval people were ignorant, backward, or primitive, you'll know better. You'll know that they were actually quite sophisticated in the ways that matter most. And maybe, just maybe, you will start asking the really important question. If they could figure out how to live well 800 years ago, why can't we? The answer to that question might just change everything. Because the truth is, we have all the technology and resources we need to create a world that combines the best of medieval wisdom with modern capabilities. We just need the courage to admit that maybe, in our rush toward the future, we left some pretty important things behind. Maybe it's time to go back and pick them up.